Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Crossover into Breakthrough Ministries. Continuing on with our series on America's Providential history. We're going to wrap it up this week by Thursday. Today we're in Chapter 16, The War for the Union. There are three basic American documents. Number one, the Declaration of Independence. Secondly, the Constitution. And thirdly, George Washington's farewell address. And when Washington left office in the year of 1786, he gave one of the most insightful speeches in history because he had perceived some dangerous trends to the spiritual to the trends, to the survival of our nation. Let me say that again. He had perceived some dangerous trends to the survival of our nation. And so, in his speech, this is what he said. And let me quote. He said, "You should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest. Your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and the love of one ought to render to you the preservation of the other." Then he goes on to state some things which may disturb our union. He talks about the spirit of party, and I quote, "Men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party in order to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts." Can you relate to that today? I'm sure you can. "The alternate dominion of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, will gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. Also, it opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find facilitated access to the government itself through channels of party passions." George Washington was a seer. He was prophetic. He had prophetic insight. Amazing. I find that just absolutely amazing. And not only him, but some of the other founders as well, if you studied their lives. All right, then he talks about the spirit of encroachment. And Washington was urging each branch or individual official to, and I quote, "confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another." The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments in one, and this to create whatever the form of government, a real despotism. Then he goes on to emphasize the real protection against these dangers were three things: religion, morality, and knowledge. And so, to put it in other words, the letter of the Constitution will never work perfectly if the spirit of the Constitution departs it. It does not work for people that do not have Christian character. It's totally impossible, because the founding fathers recognized that, and it's right in the founding documents about a virtuous and moral people. And based on Washington's observations, we can begin to understand the events which led then to the war between the states. So, there is the issue of slavery, and that's what precipitated the war. Now, the founding fathers all believed that involuntary slavery was evil. It needed to be abolished. But slavery had been around for a long, long time in every nation, and since it was so entrenched, it had to gradually be overcome. Now, many of the founders, they had slaves themselves. We know that from reading history, but they continued to advocate for their freedom, and they worked to educate the slaves, to prepare them for their eventual freedom. Now, they realized that the Constitution, did not abolish the slavery issue completely, but it did make two big steps toward the goal of freeing the slaves. First off, the southern states agreed to acknowledge that blacks were persons in the eyes of the law for the first time, but they were only counted as 3/5 of a person. But still, for the South, that was a major concession. And then secondly, the southern states also agreed to abolish the slave trade by the year of 1808. But you see, there were two problems here with this slavery issue. Number one, the North wanted it abolished immediately. Right now, we want the slavery issue done. But the South, they couldn't do that immediately because their economy was dependent upon the slaves. So they were pleading to have more time. But the North had the votes necessary to abolish slavery right away. Then you had two states, Georgia and South Carolina. They threatened to pull out of the Union completely if that would take place. So now then, enter a man by the name of George Mason. He was a Christian statesman from Virginia, and he rose and addressed that Congress, and he sternly warned the delegates, and this is what he said, and I quote, "Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven upon a country as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world. They must be in this by an inevitable chain of causes and effects. Providence punishes national sins by national calamities." So, national sins he brought up. The founders went further, and the same year they passed the Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited slavery in all of the new states. But then in 1788, they abolished the slave trade between the states. You see, God wanted to demonstrate to the entire world how a Christian nation would deal with a major social issue such as this slavery. Now, in 1834, by that time, England ended slavery, but America failed to deal with it as God had purposed. And one reason for that was greed. And that's one of the downfalls of capitalism, is greed. The Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil, and it certainly has played out in the history of the United States. In the year 1783, Eli Whitney, you remember him? He invented the cotton gin. And this cotton gin made profits even greater if you had slaves. The southern states began to argue that each state was free to decide if they wanted slavery or not. And they appealed to the fact that in the Constitution, the founders left it this way. But by doing so, they were adhering to the letter of the law, but rejecting the spirit or intentions behind it. Now we need to talk about the principle of union. The principle of union. John Calhoun, he was promoting the principle of self-government. And then right next to him, you had Daniel Webster. He was promoting the principle of union. And so there were three Christian statesmen who had a role to play in this Civil War. They were Christian men, Webster, Clay, and Calhoun. They gave speeches on this principle, and they took place in the so-called Golden Era of Congress. Now, the Civil War was sharply focused on the slavery issue, but the principle of union hung in the balance. The founders categorically rejected the very loose-knit Articles of Confederation, and that's why they wrote the Constitution. You see, it's like a marriage covenant. If problems arise, you must be patient and work through them because divorce is never an option. And so then, because of the slavery issue, this was causing a great division then between the North and the South. And a union cannot be broken for any reason as long as there are constitutional avenues for redress. So therefore, the Southern states, they were pushing to secede from the Union. And that prompted then Abraham Lincoln to go to war to resolve this problem. Now, it'd be totally inaccurate to think that the North was more spiritual than the South. Not at all. The reality of the situation was that in the South, that became the center of true revival and a stronghold of Calvinism and Christian character, while in the North, they moved more toward Unitarianism and a very, very dead formalism without any real personal relationship with God. That was the North. So, the Almighty hand, the Almighty, He has His own purpose. And the Civil War was unique in all of the history of America. You had a Christian nation, North and South, compromised the slavery issue. But you see, the almighty hand of God was in it. God could not allow this to thwart or hinder His destiny for America in the rest of the eyes of the world. So He used the war, yes, to judge America, but at the same time also redeem America back into His plan, His purpose, His destiny for us. We're going to look at the Christian characteristics of just two of the generals. First of all, Robert E. Lee. Now, Lincoln offered Lee the command of the Union Army. And so after much prayer, Lee turned it down. And this is what he said. He said, "I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned 4 million slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my home state?" But then later on, Lee seemed like he had a change of heart. And so he accepted the command of the Virginia Army. And he had a conversation then with a minister who asked him, "Is it your expectation the issue of this war will be to perpetuate the institution of slavery?" So here's Lee's response. "The future is in the hands of Providence. But if the slaves of the South were made mine, I would surrender them all without struggle to avert the war." The minister asked him again, "What he was basing his reasoning on and how he expected to win. And Lee said this: "My reliance is in the help of God." And the minister said, "Are you optimistic of the result?" And Lee says this: "At present, I am not concerned with results. God's will ought to be our aim, and I am contented that his designs should be accomplished and not mine." All right. Stonewall Jackson. Remember him? Many think he was perhaps the best military general in the history of America. And he commanded, of course, the Confederate troops. He won victory after victory. And he displayed tremendous calm and peace under fire, which attracted people to notice. And then someone asked him how he did it. And so this is Jackson's response: "Captain, my religious belief teaches me to feel as safe in battle as I do in bed. God has a fixed time for my death. I do not concern myself about that, but to be always ready, and no matter what it may overtake me, when it may overtake me, Captain. That is the way all men should live, and then all would be equally brave." So we're going to close it out by looking at both positive and negative effects of the war. The positive aspects of the war: well, number one and foremost, slavery was abolished, helped to open up the way that it ended also worldwide. And then another very important aspect was preservation of the Union. The United States remained one nation under God. And then it was able to set the example for the entire world. The negative aspects after the war: an anti-God, radical, Republican element in the government arose, and it exerted just tremendous influence in the Reconstruction, and they can gain control in Congress because they wanted to centralize power and share, and shape the nation to their philosophy. And so to accomplish this, they had to remove the force of Calvinism in America, which of course opposed the centralization of the government. And so they used post-war control of Congress then to reconstruct the South, and they passed the 14th Amendment to accomplish that goal. And that explains the strong bias against the Republican Party for many decades then. And it's only over in modern times is where that has changed. And so also the bias against blacks became more bitter and entrenched than before the war. And that is a sad commentary on our nation. It's taken many decades for the biases to be healed. And in some instances, they're still not healed. And we still have to keep praying over this situation. The increase in the power of the federal government continued to grow and go way beyond the authority granted in the Constitution. And today we have a government that's way out of control. So that's it. Chapter 16. Next time tomorrow, Chapter 17, the American apostasy and decline. And that's another important chapter in our history. And so I trust that you're going to have a wonderful day. I pray for the peace of God to rest with you and just walk in your God's will and purpose for your life for this day. Just take one day at a time. That's all you have to do. One day at a time, sweet Jesus, okay? And if you have any opportunity to speak out for God this day, don't hesitate, but be bold and speak forth his word. But whenever we speak, we must do it through love, right? I pray for God every day, Lord, let me see. Open the eyes of my heart. Let me see through the lens of your word so that I can speak words of truth, words of comfort, words of encouragement, okay, to those who I might be in conversation with. So you do the same thing, right? And if we all are working together, we can see society begin to change. Okay? So God bless you. We'll see you right here tomorrow.